Good morning, my name is Maria Pinto. This is my assessment task 3 for ESH 150. Prior to commencing my activity, I used whole class grouping and direct instructions to activate background knowledge by reminding my students that they'd recently explored the necessary elements required to maintain a healthy plant. They'd commenced their science understanding of biological sciences by engaging with the concept of living things having basic needs. And this had involved them potting and watering and positioning their plants in their pots and in their classes. During this engagement process, where students were busy with their plans, alternative conceptions were articulated, with many students firmly stating that plants needed water over the weekend period. Students made a lot of connections to themselves, like my dog would starve if I didn't feed her on the weekend, and I would probably starve if Mum didn't give me water on the weekend. This led to a robust discussion about what basic needs were priority and what the plant could do without. And students' opinions were mixed, with the majority though feeling that water was the main element required, followed by sunlight. And air and food definitely were elements students acknowledged were needed. And it provided a real insight into their alternative conceptions about a plant's food and a plant's nutrients. That discussion led to this activity titled "What Can a Plant Live Without?" and it was designed for a foundation year, approximately 20 students in a class. 5 students bravely offered to sacrifice their plants in the name of science, and as a class it was decided that 4 of the 5 plants would be deprived of one of the main elements. At the commencement of this learning activity, my teaching strategies included making my students' learning visible to them by informing them of their expected outcomes and the means by which they could expect to achieve them. I make their learning visible by explicitly stating what scientific behaviour processes I would expect to see them engaging in. This teaching strategy enables students to always know what they're supposed to be doing and how to do it to be successful. To start with, students would be asked to sit knee to knee with their neighbour and quickly recap the basic elements they remembered from lessons before. This encouraged the sharing of ideas and listening to others' opinions, and it benefited all students. Due to Foundations Year's developing literacy skills, the strategy of POE, predict, observe and evaluate, is most effective in determining any misconceptions held by students, as well as providing them with a non-intimidating manner to make suggestions and then reassess their ideas. Piaget would suggest that students benefit from multiple experiences that allow their understanding to deepen. Therefore, with each passing day's observation, they construct new understanding, which they add to old understanding, and they're able to link these different schematas together. This activity is designed to promote student inquiry skills, as they're initially required to record their predictions on which plant would die first or perhaps deteriorate the most quickly based on what element it was missing. And predicting generally requires students to substantiate their claim. So they would record their predictions on this A3 activity sheet, which would be used for formative assessment and also direct upcoming lessons. As far as the Department of Education goes, they remind us that as educators, under our duty of care, we must ensure safe conditions for workplace learning. Therefore, as with previous learning, when the children actually created their little plants, there was a big push on the soil wasn't to be eaten because children were touching the soil. If they were going to be smelling during their observations, one quick breath is all we wanted them to take. And between the touching and the creating of these pot plants and touching of the leaves, touching of the soil, they needed to wash their hands, come back and record their observations. I commenced scaffolding my activity by modelling a think aloud. The inquiry skills needed to make a prediction, such as making a connection to my prior knowledge. I would say sort of all these plants look healthy now, but I know the plants in my house always die because I forget to, whatever I forget to do. I would draw a picture of what I imagine each plant would look like after a week without the essential element it was labelled with. Using the strategy of think aloud, it democratises the room because it means that every student gets the same opportunity from the learning space. It models to students how they can be successful, and it does involve guesswork on my expectations. It also gives me the opportunity to scaffold literacies of science when I draw and label a diagram or use scientific terms in my observation. In a class situation, I would then start to hand over responsibility to the students by encouraging them to observe and record their prediction. Transmission is a teaching strategy that I wouldn't employ in this situation because students generally had knowledge of plants gained from experiences either at preschool or families. However, had I had students from a diverse culture, some transmission would be required because they may have been unfamiliar with certain scientific terms I was using. I would model talking aloud using my 5 senses to make observations and record them. So for example, I may say with the first plant, oh, this plant looks really healthy because its leaves look really green and they feel very firm. I'd also use that strategy to locate information and evidence that supported or disproved my prediction. So I could have predicted that the plant with no water would be really, really dry. And I could touch the soil and think, oh, but this soil's still really moist. Does anyone know what moist means? Anyone remember what it means? I think this strategy assists students to realise that their initial predictions aren't always correct, but in scientific thinking, new understanding is very important and it's expected. It's always expected. I feel this activity meets the curriculum's requirements because prior to this activity, students already knew the requirements of living things. Their understanding is deepened when they're required to locate and use evidence with which to base and justify their opinions on. And further, when they have to use general capabilities such as critical and creative thinking and personal and social capabilities, they're using them with engaging with other people's ideas and listening to other people's ideas. Literacy processes such as drawing or labelling are embodied in these science experiments because students have to record their observations and their developing knowledge, which adds to their understanding. This inquiry question, how much water should we give plants, would create a very rich discourse because students would initially make a great deal of connections to themselves. However, students perhaps with higher cognition or perhaps students, depending on their experiences, may wonder about plants in the desert which receive little water, or they may have plants in their home that they never see watered. This activity also connects with the cross-curriculum priorities of students as they may discuss the water droughts in Australia depending on the connections they're able to make. Day three's observations would most definitely lead to some interesting conversations. If students noted the water beads on the plant deprived of air, it'd be very interesting to see what alternative conceptions they come up with, whether they understand condensation or whether they think somehow water is trapped in there and how the water's gotten there. Would be very interesting. Most likely the expectation to record their findings would have students noticing the similarities between the plants deprived of water and the plants deprived of nutrients, both of which their leaves have actually started to droop. Now, to help students with their alternative conception between a plant's nutrients and food would require explicit teaching of photosynthesis at a rudimentary level, of course, and this would require the strategy of transmission to be implemented because of the technical terms that students most likely would never have heard. Students will probably benefit from a couple of small sections, 2 to 3 child-friendly YouTube clips. They give a really basic explanation of it with diagrams as well, just to help them distinguish. Having said that, I think at this particular stage of the demonstration, it could really go in a lot of different ways and become very student-led, depending on their understandings, depending on their alternative conceptions, depending on their interests and the conversation. It'd be a wonderful conversation to eavesdrop on. This inquiry question, what type of sunlight do plants need? It might stump students depending on the condition of the plants with no sunlight and any changes made to their understanding after a brief explanation of photosynthesis, as this question may add to their understanding or further strengthen their alternative conception, which in turn directs future learning and planning. Student-generated representations, SGRs, allow for students' individuality and creativity and authentic forms of dialogue concerning the representations to occur. The observation chart encourages students to develop their own ideas in original and creative ways because there's no restriction on how they record their findings because the manner in which they choose to observe and represent their findings assists in assessing their conceptual understandings. Now, students would begin to take responsibility of their own representations by making choices as to whether they draw or they label or they write or little sentences. This activity also provides visual and tactile experiences, which is considerate of various learning styles. As students in their groups rotate around the different plants every day, they're collaborating and they're working together and they're listening to each other. So within this activity, I have the opportunity to gradually release responsibility by initially modelling how POEs are substantiated, but then slowly withdrawing and allowing the students to conduct their own observations and their discussions with less and less assistance with me. This hands-on constructivist technique should provide meaningful and deeper understanding. So for example, on this particular day when the photos were taken, it was quite a sunny day and the effect on the plants was quite profound. So as the students experience that and get the opportunity to discuss the vast difference, especially the plant with no air, that adds to their understanding and deepens their understanding. Now, this activity provides an authentic learning experience where the activities are purposeful and the students are genuinely required to make predictions, to listen to each other, to discuss any changing ideas while providing evidence to substantiate their ideas. Because the ultimate aim is for students to eventually adopt these strategies independently across all facets of their learning. I thought this would be a really interesting inquiry question. Why are weeds so hardy when other plants die? Because I'm sure children, the vast majority of them, would have the experience of their parents complaining about weeds. Or if not, that could be a really interesting student-led inquiry as to why some plants are hardy and some plants don't survive. And we could even walk around the school and have a look at the plants, have a look at the weeds, have a look at the conditions, hopefully find some weeds growing out of concrete or bricks to further entice the students to ask really interesting questions. At the end of this demonstration, I see students returning to their original sheet and recording their final observations of the plants next to their original predictions. I see students gathering in their groups to discuss their findings, and a spokesperson from each group would articulate any surprises they witnessed or evidence that supported the predictions that came true. I see this as displaying their science understanding and articulate further wonderings. I feel the outcomes, the activity and the assessment are aligned to provide students with an authentic and genuine learning experience. The observation sheets together with the recording sheets that accompany the activity and the notes that I would be taking in a real class scenario based on their feedback and the discussion I had heard and been part of would be used as a formative assessment. I wouldn't have summative assessments because this would be part of a bigger unit of work. Students would also have the opportunity to make a final reflection, which would further give me an indication of their understanding on I wonder why, or I know this because. Once again, putting them in a situation where they have to substantiate their understandings. The students' interest, their fascination, and perhaps the connection they may have made with the water beads or condensation that they see in their everyday life, like getting into a cold car or jumping out of a shower into a steam-filled room, could lead to a really natural student-led inquiry, which would transition beautifully into an earth and space science unit about the environment and its effects on everyday life, especially if during the experiment they're lucky enough to get the particularly warm day we had in the last day and to see the profound effects that it had on the plant. That would just naturally lead beautifully into that unit of work.